morning, everybody. It is still morning, right? My name is Val Williams, and I'm with the National Youth Screening and Assessment Project, NYSAP for short. Oh, sorry. Closer. NYSAP for short. Too close? Okay. NYSAP for short. We're based at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Mass. at the Center for Mental Health Services Research. And one of our main roles is to help agencies select and implement screening and assessment tools, and that includes risk assessment tools, which I'm going to talk a bit about today. I was thinking last night that I wish that I had added some links to some new resources that NYSAP has put out, but throughout the presentation I'm going to kind of hold up the resource, and my email is on the last slide, so please don't hesitate to email me if you'd like to see any or all of the pieces that I refer to. An outline of the points that I'd like to touch on this morning. I just want to do a little bit of background, talk about areas where screening and assessment are important. Sorry, I'm going to move around a lot because I'm not used to looking at the screen on the computer. Mental health and juvenile justice and risk in juvenile justice. I want to talk about some guiding principles and concepts with risk assessment, which, having listened to a couple of other presentations, it's clear that's on a lot of folks' mind, and there's a lot of discussion about that. So, selecting an assessment tool, and this is a broader piece. This kind of refers to both screening and assessment tools in terms of thinking about important qualities of these tools and going through some examples, specifically of risk needs tools. I also want to talk about implementation. I'm a little bit of an implementation freak. I'll try to control myself. Talk about what risk assessments don't do. Talk about some examples of those tools that might accompany risk assessment, pieces that could supplement risk assessment, and some critical steps in implementation. I want to step back for a minute because doing all the on-site technical assistance work I've done for the past 13 years, it's really clear to me that folks often use the term screening and assessment interchangeably. Am I too close?
The microphone's too close to it.
Oh, okay. Interference. The terms screening and assessment are often used interchangeably, and I just want to begin with a reminder of how these two types of tools are different. Oh, and I was talking with Randy, and questions as they emerge, please just raise your hand and ask. I think that's the best way to get discussion going. Screening is not screening unless it's used with every youth at intake. Screening identifies kids who might have the characteristics that you're looking for: mental health needs, substance abuse needs, risk for recidivism, which we're going to talk more about. So screening flags kids with these characteristics, so it identifies a smaller subgroup of those kids so that you can really focus your attention and your resources on a smaller subset. It sorts kids into categories to give you early warning for emergencies, so it helps you flag kids who might have more immediate needs, and helps you decide on need for more detailed and individualized assessment, which we're going to talk about. Now, I don't focus a lot on screening in this presentation. I focus more on assessment. Assessment is that essential follow-up to screening. It's that second layer. And assessment basically targets those kids that were screened in by the screening process. Sorry, I'm just going to catch up my notes real quick. I want to talk about risk for recidivism tools. It sounds like that, like I said, that's a hot topic, and I want to go through some basic concepts and also talk about some research that's out there and implementation specifically. But assessments are used for service delivery and treatment planning, post-disposition, and aftercare. This slide just shows three very broad categories of types of mental health assessments in juvenile justice, and the clinical needs category, the educational needs category, and the functional rehabilitation needs category. This slide shows you some examples of tools in the first category. And I'm going to throw around a lot of acronyms for tools, but once again, if you'd like some more detail on a particular tool, please don't hesitate to talk to me afterwards or email me with your questions. The first tool on this list is the voice disc, the diagnostic interview schedule for children. It's called the Voice because it's electronic. It was one of the earliest electronic tools. And this tool is sometimes listed as a screening tool and sometimes as an assessment tool. I listed it as an assessment tool here because it takes about an hour to complete. And we know one of the characteristics of a screening tool is that it's generally brief, right? So that's why I've put it in this category. And people put it in screening category, I think, mostly because the tool identifies or flags kids who need follow-up on the suggested diagnoses that the results give you. The next tool is the BASC-2, the Behavioral Assessment System for Children. This just gets at various symptoms for psychopathology in kids and adolescents. The PADI, the Practical Adolescent Dual Diagnosis Interview. It's a guided interview that also suggests diagnoses, but those are focused on substance abuse and mental health issues. And the last tool here is the Child Behavior Checklist Youth Self-Report. Now this tool gets at two very basic bits here. It gets at internalizing and externalizing issues. Now the CBCL has a lot of research backing it up. It's part of the assessment, what's the acronym for this? The Achenbach system of empirically based assessment. Many years of research backing up this tool. Now, I didn't make a slide for the functioning rehabilitation needs types of tools, but if I had, I would certainly include the CAFAS, the Child and Adolescent Functional Assessment Scale, K-Hodges scale. Many years of research backing this tool up. And she recently came out with a brief version of the CAFAS. I don't know if folks have heard of it, the JIF, the Juvenile Inventory for Functioning. Oh, there's some nods. And the research on that new, like, abbreviated tool is just coming out now. The GAIN would certainly be included on the list, and the GAIN is a family of tools, and Randy's going to talk a bit more about the GAIN, but it's a comprehensive biopsychosocial tool, and there's a lot of research backing up the fact that it predicts substance use. I'd also include the CANS, the John Lyons tool, Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths. There are lots of versions of the CANS because it's easily tailorable. There's a Juvenile Justice version. And although this particular tool actually has some content that gets at mental health problems and substance use and risk, it doesn't actually measure those domains in the way that we think of a tool measuring things. This CANS tool was developed mainly as a mechanism to support consistent communication about a child's needs and level of functioning. And it's played a really important role in lots of systems of care projects, as you all probably know. Oh, and this is the first place, gosh, I hate it that that's getting on video. This is the first place where I want to reference a resource, a piece that just came out in January of this year. Gina Vincent, the other co-director of NISAP, did this piece. It was with the Technical Assistance Partnership for Child and Family Mental Health, and I highly recommend this. It's actually a very good summary of all the things that I'm talking about today. And as I said, don't hesitate to email me for any of these resources.
What's it called?
Oh, it's Screening and Assessment in Juvenile Justice Systems, Identifying Mental Health Needs and the Risk of Reoffending. I like the pieces that are fresh and new because they summarize the latest research, right? And it's always good to get kind of a review. Shifting gears to risk assessment. What is a risk assessment tool? Well, I first start by defining what I mean by risk. And I mean the risk for reoffending, the risk for engaging in future delinquent offenses. I'm not talking necessarily about truancy or violations related to substance abuse. I'm talking about the more major things. So risk assessment tools get at the question, is this youth at relatively low or relatively high risk for reoffending? And here, in other words, I just mean relative to their peers, what is their risk for reoffending? And some but not all risk assessment tools also get at what is causing the youth to be at low or high risk for reoffending. And we refer to these as crime-producing needs or dynamic risk factors or criminogenic risk factors. Those are all the terms that we use somewhat interchangeably to apply to this group of needs factors. So some risk assessment tools include these needs components, but some don't. But both types of tools are considered risk assessment, as long as they get at a youth's risk of reoffending. What's some of the research evidence around risk needs assessment? Well, there's a lot of research out there that tells us why risk needs assessment is important. We know a lot about what is effective programming for young offenders. One thing that we definitely know at this point is that punitive sanctions do not have a significant effect on reoffending. And here I'm going to try to use my green laser. Here I'm referring to work by Gaddy et al. From 2009. In this study, they looked at kids age 10 and into adulthood, kids who had come into contact with the juvenile justice system even for just community service, okay? And they found that the youth who came into the juvenile justice system for community service, were significantly more likely to be arrested in adulthood, actually 2 times more likely than their peers who had similar offenses and were not at all exposed to the juvenile justice system. So when they went and looked further at their data, they saw that kids in probation were actually 14 times more likely to be arrested in adulthood relative to kids with the same kinds of offenses. We know that if it's 14 times on probation, then it's much likely to be higher if a youth is in, say, a detention or a correctional setting. The large meta-analysis that Mark Lipsey did in 2009 showed us that most low-risk youth are unlikely to reoffend even if there's no intervention. So basically, we can pretty much leave those youth alone, right? But mixing them with high-risk youth can certainly make them worse.
Can I get a comment on that?
Absolutely.
Thanks. Actually, in my former life, I was in charge of funding part of this work because there's been, and I don't know if it still exists in justice right now, but there was a time where justice was very concerned about doing any kinds of group treatment with youth involved in the justice system. And what Lipsey found and what we found in other studies is if you take these very low-risk youth and mix them with very high-risk youth, yeah, certainly there's a possibility of iatrogenic effect, meaning the high-risk youth are going to drag them up. But if you're looking at people who are similar in terms of their risk and severity, and you have them in groups, there is absolutely no evidence for any iatrogenic effect going along if the groups are well run. Mm-hmm. So I've run into a lot of justice systems that just grabbed all of that and said, well, we can't do groups anymore. So that's what
that's a really important point. Thanks.
I have a question out there.
Oh, question. Hi.
You said that youth that were put on probation 14 times more likely to reoffend than youth that other youth who had the same type.
Who were not, yes, were not on probation. Mm-hmm.
Now, did they look at any factors other than the fact that they were on probation? Was there other factors that they were able to look at? Because, I mean, that's a pretty...
Yes, that's dramatic.
Times, that's pretty high.
I'm trying to think of some of the other factors that they controlled for. Does somebody just say something? I would have to look back at the literature. I have it with me, so I can do that in just a second to remember. I'm sure, I know that they controlled for some factors. I'm just not sure exactly what they were. So I'll get back to you in just a minute. Very good question. It is a dramatic difference, 14 times. Anything else? Okay. We also have good evidence that when services are matched to youth's crime-producing needs, their criminogenic, dynamic needs, this lowers the chance of repeat offending. And we know that matching is particularly important for youth who are leaving placement and returning to the community, right? And the goal is to match the level of service to the risk level and needs that we learn about from the risk assessment tool. So the overall goal is to have the right services for the right youth, and not talking about piling on services, because we know that piling on services can possibly have no effect or maybe be detrimental. Talking about matching those services, and I'll give some examples in just a minute. Randy's going to talk extensively about this. So the overall goal is to have the right services for the right youth, and to do that you need a valid risk assessment tool. So hopefully the risk assessment tool is the first step before you make some key decisions so that you can use that information to inform decisions. If properly implemented, a risk needs assessment tool can identify youth at the highest risk for reoffending and guide intervention efforts. Tell us how much supervision a youth might need out in the community, services received, and placement. And of course, the hope is that we will, in doing that, prevent reoffending, reduce risk of future harm, and reduce costs all around. This graphic really gets at the risk needs responsivity model, which I know you are all very familiar with. This first piece is, here's our tool, and hopefully it's being administered prior to making important decisions like whether to confine, release, or leave a youth in the community. And this, I'm discovering I'm really bad with my left hand. Hold on. The risk needs tool gets at the risk principle, so it tells us who to target, right, by giving us the results and indicating which category, low, moderate, or high risk level a youth is in. So with that information, we know who to target. We know that the low risk youth should not be getting any attention or minimal attention, right? And it's the high risk youth for whom we should really focus more interventions, more structure, more resources, and that those high needs for that particular youth should be prioritized and addressed first when case planning. And the risk needs assessment tool also gets at that needs principle, telling us what to target, right? The criminogenic needs, those dynamic factors are the things we really want to focus on, because conceivably those are the things that we could change, right? That's a place where we could intervene and hopefully make a difference. And we want to take that information and, of course, connect with service. Now, just an example, this, say a youth is in a high need level in the family service area. This could be, say, the parents are doing, poor monitoring of the youth or inconsistent discipline. And it could be that a family-focused service of high intensity would really get at that and could be really helpful in this situation. And of course, the ultimate goal being reduce rearrest. Here's another piece that gets at some of the recent research looking at potential for case management if assessment is implemented properly. This was an archival study of 122 youth who were followed after having been administered the YLS CMI. a tool that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And this was administered by clinicians, social workers, and probation. And they followed these kids, they tracked them out at least a year. And they looked to see if the need areas that were identified by the risk assessment tool were actually addressed by the services, by the referrals and the services that they got. And what they found is that there was a group with a poor match, that is a group of kids where only 25% or less of their identified needs were actually addressed with services. And there was a good match group where 75% or more of the identified needs were addressed with services. And you can see that this difference is pretty pronounced in terms of recidivism. The poor match group is at around 75% reoffending within 1 year, compared to the good match group, which is less than 30%. And that's a really dramatic difference. And this is irrespective of the youth's risk level and irrespective of the number of services that the youth received, which makes it especially dramatic. Does anybody have any questions about this piece of research? Because I know I'm summarizing these in just a few sentences, and they're really excellent studies with extensive and lots of detail that I'm overlooking. Oh, I did want to mention another resource here. A MacArthur funded knowledge brief that Gina Vincent put out a few months ago on can risk assessment improve juvenile justice practices. She is in the process of wrapping up a research study, a multi-site prospective study. Basically, that's an elaboration of the research that I was just highlighting. And it's a wonderful piece. It is preliminary results, but the more recent results are actually coming out in the literature now. So again, if you're at all interested, I'd be glad to send that to you. And now for just a very brief overview of some concepts. Now, I've already talked about some of these as we were going through. We talked about a comprehensive risk assessment having these pieces, right? They get at static risk factors, and those are risk factors that are not going to change. Those are things that follow you throughout their life, like whether they had a history of drug abuse or the age of their first offense, things that are not going to change. And dynamic risk factors, the criminogenic needs here. These are the things that could conceivably change, like current substance use or social relations or engagement with education. So those are the things we want to focus on because they could possibly be changed, and that's a place to intervene and make a difference. The protective or responsivity factors are factors that could buffer a youth's risk. And they're tied to responsivity, how the youth responds to treatment. This little box here that gets at well-being or non-criminogenic needs, these are a component that aren't usually included in the risk assessment tools, but may give you really important information about mental health problems or substance use problems, exposure to trauma, things that you would want to know that don't necessarily elevate a youth's risk for reoffending, but could really inform some of your treatment decisions, right? So that's why it's really important to supplement a risk assessment tool with other tools that are going to yield different kinds of information. I had no idea that my slides were so sophisticated that they went point by point. These are some terms that I've already talked about. One thing that I do want to mention here is some additional dynamic needs or crime-producing criminogenic needs. I mentioned poor school engagement, current substance use, could be poor parental monitoring or inconsistent discipline, like I mentioned earlier in the previous example. Could be poor school performance, behavior problems at school. These are just some of the other dynamic risk factors out there. Critical step, and I'm stepping back here and I'm talking more broadly here. I'm talking about mental health, screening and assessment tools in general, okay? All of those types of tools. It's really important to think about what are the important characteristics of these tools and how do you go about deciding what's the best tool to use. You really need to be an informed consumer these days. There are a lot of tools out there and a lot of snazzy, people pushing them. So I want to take a few minutes to kind of talk about some of these critical bits. Oh gosh, that's very sophisticated. Okay. I wanted to show both of these first two bullets at the same time, but I'm not going to be able to. But basically, the first question is, what are the objectives? When you're thinking about selecting a tool, what's the question that you want answered? And for what purpose? Risk management, placement decision, classification? For what type of youth? And this last bullet here really should be a broader category that is something more like thinking about the costs associated with implementing a tool, right? Because I can think of at least 10 things here. But the first things that come to mind have to do with, who's going to be administering it? Clinicians or intake officers? How long is it going to take to administer? Is there a per administration cost associated with the tool? Because there are some expensive tools out there, right? And it's things like that that really need to be taken into consideration very early on in the process. And how much training is required? Because gosh, that's a highly variable piece right there. How am I doing on time? I'm doing okay, right? Okay. Again, this is speaking broadly about screening and assessment tools in general, but evidence-based tools should be standardized. They should have a manual that includes very clear, concrete scoring procedures, right? And administration procedures, so that tool can be given in a consistent manner with absolutely every youth that you're giving it to, right? It needs to be relevant to assist you with making the necessary decisions that you've already identified, because your earlier step was to identify those decisions. The tool needs to be reliable. And I'm talking EBT. Got to throw these acronyms in there when I can. I'm talking EBT here. Evidence-based tools need to be reliable, and at NISAP we consider that to be 2 studies by independent researchers that aren't linked to the success or the economic success of a tool in peer-reviewed publications. And a reliability study, a good one, would show that 2 independent raters would reach similar conclusions, each administration. Validity is critical. Lots of different types of validity, as there are different types of reliability. What comes to mind first for me is criterion validity. There's concurrent validity, which is comparing the tool that you're trying to validate to another previously validated, already validated tool, right, that was administered at the same time. So you kind of borrow the validity of that other established tool. And certainly predictive validity, which means that there's a strong association between what the tool is telling you and something like recidivism for a risk needs assessment tool, right? That it predicts recidivism at some point in the future. That time element is critical. Again, at least 2 studies by independent researchers. And the one that you select, I think I might have overlooked it. Nope. The one that you select should also be feasible. I think I should have made this very sophisticated and flash and move around to get your attention, because in all of my experience on the ground with folks implementing various tools, Feasibility is key. Yes, and he's fine too. Pilots are essential, right? You read about a tool, you hear people talk about a tool, and it seems like it's reasonable. It seems like you can do it in your setting in a certain amount of time with a certain amount of effort and resources, but really needs to be piloted so that you can determine in your context if it is feasible, if it meets the practical demands of your context. Population appropriate, developed for or validated on juvenile justice youth in the right setting. That's critical, and a lot of the tools that we look at, they have excellent research backing them up, but they're just not specific to this population, so you really have to look for research that gets at the appropriate population that you want to look at. Dynamic, and this is especially important for risk needs assessment tools, right? Because you need to be doing that reassessment. Risk next year could be very different from risk this year, right? That's key. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just a few examples of evidence-based or promising tools. And these tools have all been validated in more than one jurisdiction, which is part of the reason I've kind of lumped them together. The first two tools here, the Savory, the Structured Assessment of Violence Risk in Youth, and the YLS that I just mentioned in that other study that had such dramatic results, the Youth Level of Services Case Management Inventory. These probably have, they're backed up by probably the most research at this point. I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail in a minute. The Risk and Resiliency Checklist. This gets at general reoffending. And the WSJCA. This is the Washington State Juvenile Court Assessment. It has been modified into what's called the YAZE, or the PACT, and I think used much more widely in those two forms. Folks are probably more familiar with it as the YAZE. Now you might be thinking, are there some tools up there that you expected to see that aren't up there? Anybody? I thought for sure somebody was going to throw out the Compass or the CANS JJ or the Petra or something.
Maisie.
The Maisie? Well, Maisie's a screening tool. The Maisie would be at the top of my list if I had a screener slide, because the Massachusetts Youth Screening Instrument, version 2, developed by the person that directs NISAP, Thomas Bristow, has a lot of research backing it. We're doing a review article right now. I think there are 79 peer-reviewed papers that look at the Maisie 2 in some way or another since it came out in 2003. And it's one of the few screeners that actually has national norms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of stuff as we go through these tools here.
Why not the Compass?
Well, the Compass doesn't have any validity data out there in the peer-reviewed literature at this point. We have been digging and digging, and what we do at NISAP is we have a group of folks who is constantly searching for the latest research and talking to tool developers to see if there's something coming out that we need to be aware of. And the last time that we looked 2 months ago, we look every 3 months, there was nothing new on the Compass.
What about the JACE?
The JACE.
That's just a use tool.
Yes, there is some evidence for the JACE. I'm trying to think of, I don't think there's any predictive validity data out there on the JACE. I'm pretty sure that that's one of the main things, and not by independent researchers.
Oh, yes.
Say that again, I'm
The
sorry.
Ohio tool?
The Ohio tool. The Ohio tool, I think, has some new research coming out on it. And once that research is out, we'll be reevaluating it. We do consider it a promising tool.
What did you say about Compass again?
There's no validity data out there in the peer-reviewed literature at this point.
For youth.
For youth, that's exactly correct. Sorry, somebody else had another question.
What about
The cans is an amazing tool. John Lyons has done amazing things with the cans, but as I said earlier, it really was developed as a mechanism to support consistent communication about kids' needs and level of functioning. It doesn't really measure these things the way we think of a normal psychometric tool, right? And that's why it's not up on our list. We have some really nice reviews of these tools that we've done with the developers. We always consult the developers when we're kind of doing our checks of tools periodically. If you're interested in our latest review of the cans, please email me. But it is a great tool, but it doesn't get at things the way we think it would because of the nature of the tool. So the Savory. The Savory is a structured assessment tool that was developed for risk for violent and general reoffending in kids 12 to 18. It was originally developed for risk for violent offending, but research has shown over the years that it actually has very good accuracy for predicting general reoffending. So that's why I have both of those up here. 30 items, puts kids in low, moderate, or high categories. It has a section related to protective factors, which is important, right? We want a rounded tool that's got some strengths aspect to it. Allows specification of critical items, which is a really nice feature. Lots of dynamic factors. And the overall decision is actually based on structured professional judgments, which we know from research evidence tells us that it's much better than judgments based on the tool scores alone, right? Structured decision making is really important, and that's always kind of folded into these risk assessment pieces in terms of implementation, the frame of mind. Takes about 90 minutes, which is kind of an average amount of time for these tools. And as I said, the Savory and the YLS are the risk assessment tools that right now have the most research evidence backing them up. So the YLS, CMI gets at factors that are associated with risk of recidivism, as well as needs factors, and those help with case management. And it's for kids 12 to 17, 42 items, and it's set up as a checklist. Takes about 30 minutes to score and do the interview, and it might take a little bit more time to get some collateral information. Some risk categories can be framed as strengths, which is a really nice kind of flexible aspect of the YLS. And it determines risk level based on total scores, which is an actuarial approach, but it does contain a clinical override, which allows you to adjust the risk level based on additional information, and that's proven to be very important. The YLS is probably the tool that's most widely used nationwide in probation right now. I know Pennsylvania just went statewide with the YLS over the past couple of years. And the case planning considers strengths and weaknesses, which is great. Here's the Washington State. I might need to speed up a little bit here. The Washington State tool, the tool that modified into the YAZI. So risk for reoffending, and it does have some specific risk and protective factors. It's a nice tool. It's the electronic version is great, makes things a lot easier. Now the YAZI and the Washington tool, I should say, includes a pre-screener. So if the youth scores low on that pre-screener, they don't do the full assessment. If they score moderate or high level, they do the full assessment. So it's a nice feature of the Washington tool. It makes the decisions based on cutoff scores. And as I said, it includes protective and risk factors. And it contains many dynamic risk factors that can be used for reassessment, which is great. This is the RRC, the Risk and Resiliency Checkup, risk for recidivism. 60 base items, and the JACE group that developed it allows agencies to kind of tailor it and put other items in as needed, which is really nice. It gives you a protective factor score, a risk factor score, and an overall resiliency score. And the items are scored based on previous 6 months, past year, entire life history, and 6 months prior to confinement. Those are important reference periods for this tool. It takes about an hour and a half. And I think it's Los Angeles, and is it Los Angeles and one other city, oh, San Diego, are massive users of this particular tool. They've done a lot of work with it. I want to talk a little bit about some implementation points. I held back on wearing my NICE-app implementation t-shirt that says all implementation all the time. But
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure, absolutely.
What's your view about the use of any of these for risk assessment instruments without norming it or validating it on your local population?
Well, it's if it can be done, that's ideal, but it's not always so realistic, is it, right? It's certainly the ideal situation, and that's what we try to do at NICE-app, is try to find an opportunity for doing that locally. That local validation is key. I'm thinking about some brief risk of reoffending screening tools, especially. Like I'm thinking about the ARNA, the Arizona Risk Needs Assessment, and the North Carolina Assessment of Risk. We are making major efforts to try to locally validate those each time that we use them at a site. And so far we've been pretty successful. But it's tough if there aren't enough resources. But it's certainly the ideal.
Question. How long does it take to norm one tool in your own specific
Well, it depends. Gosh, I'm having a flashback. We're working with one site right now. It's just taken a very long time because we have to get access to the recidivism data, right? We have to look at the juvenile arrest data as well as the adult, and it's getting that adult data that's sometimes challenging. But it really is limited by access, I believe, because it's not a big deal. You know, you're going to be collecting the information you need when you implement the tool. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, in terms of tracking how you're doing it and tracking outcomes. You just need that additional data on recidivism, so you can look out 1 or 2 years, whatever period you want, to see, does this tool actually predict reoffending in our population? So I think if you plan it out right and get permission to get the data ahead of time, it shouldn't take long at all. Just, do a pilot for, I don't know, maybe 3 months, depending on what the flow of kids is, and then use that pilot data, focus on that sample for your recidivism check. Are you thinking about doing that?
No, I'm just looking at, I guess the bigger picture is if you're going ahead and commit to using the tool and you don't know it's not normal to your area or environment, it's kind of pointless. You said that then you can choose another tool because that one didn't work, choose another tool because that one's not working. Kind of both darts into it.
Yes, I hear you. I would argue in this next slide I'm going to show, I think it's the next one, that as part of your plan to develop policies and procedures and your tracking system and outcome measurement, that you plan for doing that if possible. Fold that in.
The specific, say, agencies who would develop these tools, would they come into your community and norm it before you choose to purchase it?
That really depends. I mean, NICE-app, for instance, we've been trying to norm as many tools as we can while we're out there, right? Take advantage of the opportunity. And we just have made sure we talked to the developers and gotten their permission. So it really depends on the tool and the developers. But there are groups out there that will help you with that process, like NICE-app. So, but it's another important piece that I think should be folded into your plans when getting ready to implement a tool. So thanks for that question. So what risk assessment tools don't do, they're not prescriptive. You don't get all the information you need from any one tool, right, to make decisions. Not appropriate for identifying risks for sexual offending. There are lots of other specific tools for that. Not intended to replace mental health assessments. It's not getting at diagnoses. We're only trying to, get at, they do not identify potential mental health problems in need of an assessment. So they're not mental health assessments, And they typically don't include items that are unrelated to future offending, like those well-being needs. And that's, again, the reason why it's good to supplement the risk assessment tool with other tools. Here are some examples of the screening tools that might accompany risk assessment. We already talked about a lot of these. The trauma is a new piece, UCLA PTSD index, and the trauma severity checklist for children, the GAIN SS screener, the CRAFT, and the substance abuse subtle screening inventory, the SASE. I mentioned the JIF, which is a promising new tool. We consider it like a first-tier assessment because it really suggests areas for more individualized follow-up. This is the implementation is crucial slide. And again, I would have that flash if I had thought to do it. This particular graphic just breaks it down into 4 components, and I would probably break it down into 10 or 12. The risk guidelines document that NISAP is coming out with soon is a MacArthur-funded piece, which is another piece that you may be interested in. It's a great document. Breaks it down into 8 stages. I would put building policies around use of the tool and decisions first, because it's really best to start thinking about these things and develop a plan before you train staff on the tool, right? You want to do a training for those staff that not only, is standardized for that tool, but gets at some concrete pieces that are going to be in your plan, right? Staff need concrete bits about how to make decisions with the results. Can't emphasize the concrete aspect enough. I'm speeding through because I think I've taken up too much time. But one thing that I could have made a slide of, and you guys might be interested in talking about later, please come up if so. A lot of the sites we work with, what we end up doing with them to make things concrete is to make a service matrix. We have them take all the tools that they're using, what domains do their tools get at, are there decision rules for those domains for those tools, and then we have them put them against a vertical axis of risk need level, low, moderate, and high. So if a youth scores over a certain cutoff on one of your screening tools or your assessment tools, it puts them in a certain category, and you know which services fall in each of those categories. I have some examples with me today if anybody would like to see, but obviously the low level part of the grid would be empty or have hardly anything in it. But that's one thing that's been really helpful to staff at the sites we work with, to make things concrete. They can look at this matrix and say, okay, this in the mental health domain, this youth scored over this cutoff. That puts them in the high need category, and these are the services in that little box that we've mapped onto that. So I know it's kind of hard to visualize, but last thing is a quality assurance plan that's folded into the policies and procedures around the implementation of the tool. I can't emphasize quality assurance enough. We basically come up with guidelines for all the tools that we work with and try to get sites to follow that plan. It makes a huge difference, and it ties into ongoing data tracking of outcomes. I hit my time, right? Okay. I think I've gone over things enough that you've gotten the take-home messages. Risk assessment is critical, should happen early, should be supplemented by other tools, and that's a segue into Randy. Sorry to take so much time.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm not going to take time to really introduce myself. If you want to read about me, it's in your packet, because my sense of people being introduced is I've never remembered anyway after they've been introduced. So anyway, that's just me. So you can read about that. But I was a former Fed. I worked for SAMHSA, Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration. Within my portfolio there, I had juvenile justice and criminal justice, and we were focused on treatment, which is what SAMHSA does. But we also took into consideration the populations that you're dealing with, because we funded many programs with juvenile justice and with juvenile drug courts and with offender reentry programs, which are very much like Second Chance, which are still going on. So, that's the, okay. I'm not going to talk about the goals because of the time, so you'll see them at the end. This is just to show you how little work there's been done in adolescent treatment. My job here is to talk about matching a little bit and how you take the information you would get from these tools and try and match the clients up to the right kinds of services. And right now I'm focusing on substance abuse. I'll talk about mental health, trauma, a few things in a minute. But you look, these are the major studies that took place, okay? There aren't that many, and I would particularly point out the one in 1990, the Services Research Outcome Study, SORS. It was set up not to capture youth, but it ended up capturing 156 of them. So somebody had a bright idea to do an analysis on that and published it, and it got to Congress, and all funding for youth treatment got cut off for SAMHSA. Because what happened was those 156 youth got worse. Why did they get worse? They were being treated in adult-focused programs. And that does not work for youth. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. So there was not a lot done around youth treatment, and most people didn't know what to do with youth when they came into treatment. So you might be experiencing at your own place, because maybe some of your treatment providers don't know what the new research is and what it tells about who should be in what types of programs and what those programs should be providing. Because typically I find that juvenile justice, juvenile drug courts, wherever you're looking at, tend to have one referral source, maybe 2 or 3. But how many of you refer generally to one place? Well, that's unusual. Okay, so you have a multiplicity of different programs that you can refer to. Okay, good. That's great news. Because if you take a look, I'll go forward here one. From 1930 to 1997, we were able to identify only 17 studies in the literature on how to treat adolescents. And those 17 studies didn't tell you what to do. They just told you what the treatment was. It was functional family therapy, or it was BSFT, but it didn't tell you how to do it. So you had no clue what went on in the treatment. The treatment providers didn't either. And you see all the other things that were rare or pretty low there. There weren't treatment manuals. And this was as recently as 1997. Since 97, it has proliferated. There have been out of SAMHSA, let me just show you, those are just the studies since 97 that were put in place, and those are all the ones I was responsible for, some of them still going on. There are over 200 articles now from that data alone on specific issues around treatment of adolescents, how it's different from adults, and how you would treat adolescents. And that's just not for substance abuse, but it also includes co-occurring mental health disorders. It includes traumatic violence and the traumatogenic effects that happen. It includes just about anything you think of that you might want to be interested in and learning about and matching a youth treatment. So there's a lot of data that's been published, but I'll tell you what, your treatment providers, how many of you here are treatment providers? Okay, 2. I'm going to make a very gross generalization. If it doesn't apply to you, please don't feel offended. But treatment providers typically don't read the literature. They do not. And it gets worse the further down you go to the line staff. So if you go in and talk to line staff who are actually doing the therapy, they don't have a clue about this stuff that's happened since 1997, unless they've gone to a few conferences and heard some information, or they're in a very enlightened program. So you have to be really careful about where you're referring youth, and make sure you've got a very enlightened program that understands the literature and how much things have changed, and they've changed drastically since 1997 in terms of how to treat youth and how to get decent effects from that treatment. So and I'll get to a minute about how you might go about doing that. Back up here. What the early studies showed us was that you can't treat adolescents with adult models. You can't use this heavy confrontational approach that was normed on middle-aged, older white males like me who went into treatment and got terrible confrontation. We know it doesn't work for women. We know it doesn't work for youth. It may not even work that well for white males. Frankly, if anyone ever did a controlled study on that. But that is not the way to treat adolescents. If you have a highly confrontational program, particularly if it's focused on 12-step recovery models, you are probably sending your youth to the wrong place. You would want to look at that. Because if that's the case, they're going to drop out early, they're going to have poor outcomes, they're certainly not going to get better, and they'll likely get worse. So you have to also assess for a wider range, which you mentioned, of problems. It's not just looking at substance abuse or trauma, or it's looking at the entire need spectrum of the youth. So to the extent that you can have an assessment instrument that actually gets at all these things, you're in much better shape to know what the needs array are. Because without an assessment that validly tells you that, you don't know how to match a youth to a treatment program because of what services they provide. And then also you have to know what services do they provide. How many of you think you know exactly what goes on in the treatment program where your youth go? I didn't see one hand. I saw a head shaking this way. That's typically the case. People in juvenile justice, you guys are too trusting, which is absolutely paradoxical to me. I don't get it. Because, you know, typically people would think of juvenile justice or justice people as being, maybe, and here again, it's a generalization, and I'm not justice, I come from treatment, so the people I'm criticizing are my own, not you guys. But typically people would think of justice professionals as being very skeptical and suspicious of things and really wondering what's going on and are they getting the true story. But you swallow hook, line, and sinker what your treatment programs tell you they're doing. We're doing a good job. Okay, great. What the heck does that mean? I don't know. You really need to educate yourself about what's going on in treatment and find out what those programs that you're referring youth to actually do, and are they doing the kinds of treatment that we have all the evidence-based practices for now that have been developed that will match up with the needs that you identify for your youth in treatment. If you don't do that, you're falling down on what you really need to do, because your treatment providers are not going to come into you and say, you know, I really want to confess to you that we can't deal with trauma. That's not something we do well. If they have co-occurring disorders, that's not, you know, our forte. You probably want to refer them somewhere else. In this state of shrinking dollars, okay, if I'm your typical treatment program and you're referring somebody to me, I can fix it, right? And that will be the approach that most will take. Not all, but most will take. Can guarantee it. And we've seen that in study after study when we looked at that. And you can see the other things there. I can skip forward here. And for the sake of time, to get you out of here so you don't walk out on me or I walk out on you, either one. Could be either way. I might just get up and walk out too. We made some infrastructure changes that support evidence-based practices. And this is coming from the GAIN, which you mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about, the Global Appraisal of Individual Needs. That's an assessment tool that's a biopsychosocial assessment that does mental health, does education, does health, does a number of these areas that you want to look at. And it's one of three that are recommended by several groups, one being a group that developed a brochure that I'm going to tell you about in a minute called Treating Teens that you can get that will help you in assessing programs, but also now by currently the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges and a grant that they have from OJJDP, which you should perk your ears up because there may be money for actually providing services and training and those kinds of things to you. Now, it's for juvenile drug courts, okay? But how many of you have a juvenile drug court somewhere around you? Okay, for those of you that have your hands up, if you don't have one yourself and you got one around you, go tell them about this, because likely they won't know. They need to find out about what the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has available and be calling them, like right now, before the money gets all spent, because the money is sitting there. And you can become attached to that training. You can become a part of that training. So training can be brought in on a number of things that juvenile drug courts are interested in, but they're also going to interest you. And one of the things they're doing are training on 3 different assessment instruments that a group of 22 experts decided were full enough in terms of biopsychosocial assessments to actually capture the needs and match youth. That's the GAIN, the CASI-A by Kathy Myers at TRI, and also the TASI or Teen ASI, the one by Gift for Common Error. Those three. They're all a little bit different, but they all capture the basics of the information that we felt was necessary for you to have to be able to make some matching decisions in terms of the treatment for your youth. Oh, that's not my phone, but it could be. I thought I turned it off. Okay. Well, you see some of the other things that happen based on that. Let's go on. Okay. Evidence-based practice. We hear a lot about that, okay? Here's what's boiled down to. If something's been tested with good outcomes, there's a manual that can be replicated and trained in the same way over and over, so you ensure consistency and good implementation, fidelity to the model. There's a training program for it that readily exists you can use. You get supervision that leads to certification, all right? There's ongoing monitoring, and there's outcomes measurement. So those kinds of things factor into what is called an evidence-based practice. And there are many lists. The state of Washington has theirs, the state of Oregon has theirs, the state of Hawaii has theirs. SAMHSA has the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices, NREPP. So there are a number of places you can go to look at what are considered evidence-based practices for various types of populations and the various needs they bring into treatment. So I would encourage you, when you're inventorying your treatment programs that are out there, look at what they're using, then go look at some of those lists and see if it's appropriate or not, because it will tell you who it was normed on. And you might be surprised. So, there are the three instruments and the support that's available. And that's all I'll say about that for now. Just wanted to show you something about the GAIN short screener. Okay, a short screener is something you want that will quickly identify if there is a need for further assessment. Now, the problem you can run into is it might way over-identify too many people. So you don't want to do that. Then the other problem is it may under-identify too many people, which is also bad. So what you want to look at are prevalence. That means how much does it exist in the community. Sensitivity, those who actually have the disorder, and specificity, how many does it capture that don't have it. And with the GAIN SS, this is a 20-item short screener, 5 questions on substance abuse, 5 on mental health, 10. 5 on internalizing disorders, 5 on externalizing disorders, and another 5 on criminogenic factors. So 20 questions can be done in 5 minutes. Training can be done over the internet. The cost is extremely low to use this. You can get trained in 1 day for your staff. It can be done in many places. The state of Washington actually requires this to be done in all youth-serving state facilities. So every youth that comes into Washington State for Child Protective Services, for any other kinds of services for youth, this is administered. And they've actually found a lot more problems around substance abuse and mental health and criminogenic factors than they've seen before. So this does fairly well for a short screener, probably as well as any of the short screeners do, because it's capturing, there should be another one, there you go. So at a level of endorsing 3 of the 5 items on each one of those 4 areas, you get 99% of the people that have the problem. You get 91% that specifically have it, and you may include maybe up to about 11% that don't. Okay? So you're maybe over-identifying by 11%, possibly on one of these areas. That's as good as I know any short screener gets for a 5-minute tool. So that's one thing to think about. The other one's 2. So this isn't a commercial for this, but this is to show you something you better be looking at if you're looking at a short screener. Okay? How well does it do those 3 things? That's what you want to look for. Who are you capturing? And this allows you to change the GAIN SS anyway, where your cut points are. So you can go higher or lower, and it will show you, by the graph, what you trade off in terms of doing that. So you can, decide that, my system really can't handle taking in that many. So I'm going to set the cut point a little bit higher and take on the more higher severity ones to move them on to an assessment. And it allows for that. Now, youth are in multiple systems, right? They're not just in juvenile justice. So they're competing kinds of things going on for them. So juvenile justice has to be very aware of all of the things that are being driven to a family and placed on them where they have to have their youth go to get things taken care of. If you were in a family with someone involved in the juvenile justice system, you'd also probably be involved with some problems at school, maybe mental health and substance abuse treatment, and it could go on. Child Protective Services. The number of appointments and places these people have to go is truly astounding. If you would ever sit down with them and talk with them about it and map it out, you know, ecologically, where do you go every week with your youth to get them to the appointments they have to go to comply with all the directives they have? That almost becomes your entire life, taking care of them. And it's very difficult for most families to do, extremely difficult. So take that into account. More importantly here, though, is that most of the youth you're going to see who come in are going to have either a substance abuse or a mental health problem. If they have a substance abuse problem, they're almost, well, up to 70%. We've seen it up to 90 in some studies, percent going to have a co-occurring mental health disorder or mental health issue. So you're not dealing with one behavioral problem. You're dealing with a number of things that co-occur together, which again goes back to why you want to have an assessment that screens for all these areas so that you can properly match your youth. The best thing to do is, let's say you have, the most likely picture is a youth with a substance abuse problem and a co-occurring mental health disorder. Conduct disorder, I'll take for externalizing, or depression, I'll take for internalizing. Okay? Those are two very common ones. One thing you need to know is your treatment program actually should be dealing, in the best of all worlds, dealing with both problems at the same time in the same place, with the same staff. So you want to think about that. Is that happening? Is it happening together? Or is it happening in two separate places? That makes it harder. They have to coordinate with each other about what the treatment is. How good do you think treatment programs are coordinating back and forth between each other, what their treatment plans are, and how they're working with the youth this week and what's going on in their lives? And yeah, no, they don't. It doesn't happen. For one thing, they don't have a lot of time to do that. For another thing, they kind of stay isolated where they are. So you want an integrated program, if at all possible. Sequential is not very good at all. Sequential means, if I'm substance abuse, I say, well, you know what? We don't really like kids on meds, so take care of that mental health problem first, and then we'll see them. You run into that? Yep. That's not a program to send your kids to. The other side is a mental health program that says, well, you know, take care of that substance abuse problem because it's maybe causing these mental health disorders. And if you get rid of that, then we can really tell what's going on. And so you fix that first, and then we'll see them. That's also the wrong way to go. These things co-occur together. And now I'm going to be terribly blasphemous to anyone from the substance abuse field, which is that for most youth, if you follow this, the mental health issues preceded the substance use disorder. There were mental health issues there before a substance use disorder manifested. Now, I'm not talking about youth who are experimenting, okay? You know, they use marijuana 3 times and you want to throw them into residential treatment. That is the wrong way to go, you know? I'm talking about youth who actually meet criteria by DSM-4 TR standards for a substance use disorder. For those youth, they typically had a mental health problem going on well before the substance use started. And many times they're self-medicating when they do that. But what happens over a period of time is the substance use disorder takes a life of its own. So they may be using non-problematically, but they cross this line into some addictive state with the drug. And then, if you take away the depression or the conduct disorder, it's not going to help with the substance use disorder. And there are interventions out there that were theoretically built to do that, to take care of the mental health piece first, and then they thought the substance abuse piece would go away. Well, they found out it doesn't. It continues to exist. So these are youth who have crossed that line. Yes?
And I won't speak for everybody else, but in our county, in our particular place, usually mental health services and substance abuse services are 2 different providers.
That's typical, yeah.
And there tends to be an issue with who's actually providing the right service.
Who does it best? Yeah.
From the mental health perspective, they're coming from the mental health perspective, and then the substance abuse are saying issues and behaviors are caused because of the substance abuse. And so they're seeing both people, and both people aren't communicating, and they're kind of, I don't know, doing more damage to the child than good.
Probably. That would be my guess. And the ironic thing is they're both right. You know, on the mental health side, they're seeing things that are being caused by the mental health disorder. On the substance abuse side, they're seeing things being caused by the substance abuse. However, those are two different things that need to be brought together, and treatment needs to be occurring with a lot of communication going on, which is why I say integrated is much better. And you can, you know, roll that out further, because when you're dealing with those, you're talking about education also. You're talking about just basic physical health needs. You're talking about all the needs that they have. So that is a problem. And who usually funds the treatment for these youth? Where does the money come from? Usually, yeah. It usually comes through the courts. So I'm going to get to a slide in a minute, because I advocate that the courts take charge where treatment goes on. But you have to do it in an informed way. And we at SAMHSA, before I left, stopped giving money to treatment programs for these justice-related kinds of issues, and we gave it to the courts for them to have control of the money, so that you can take a look at what returns you're getting for your investment, and are you getting better. And I think you need to be very proactive about that, because what you've just identified is happening everywhere across the country. It's a huge problem. I'll just point out victimization, extremely high in your populations, and those with really high levels of victimization tend to have 5 or more problems, a 13.9 times higher propensity to have 5 or more problems. 5 or more substance abuse and mental health problems when they come to treatment. So they create a very complex picture. Trauma is something that needs to be addressed separately, independently, within the treatment that you're doing. So everybody should be trauma informed in terms of the treatment. So are your substance abuse people trauma informed, you think, in their treatment? My guess is no. You can find out, though. I'll skip this line. I'll skip that one. This one talks about best fit of an evidence-based practice. So you know what will fit best for your people, for your youth, and fidelity, which we've talked about. We can go past that one. I'll show you this, okay? You can see these in your packets. You have the slides. But one thing we did is all the programs I had, we mandated they use the game. And they had to get trained and certified on the use of the game. And we mandated the treatment approach they used, and they had to get trained and certified in that best practice treatment approach. Then we had other programs that just said, use an evidence-based assessment and use an evidence-based treatment approach. And that's all they said. And you think they followed through and got all the training and certification, and likely not. But when you look at the results, in those programs where we mandated those things and monitored them and made sure it happened, you can see, this is just one indicator, 6 months post their initial assessment, how much of an increase of abstinence was there? And we see this in mental health issues too. In MET CBT5, that's only a 5-session intervention, folks. Okay, 6 months later, their abstinence rates had increased by 60%. Okay? And after ACCs, it's around 70%, 69.3. When I looked at the other programs, that's how much they improved. And we just told them to use something and make sure it's evidence-based. So again, someone has to be looking over the shoulders of those treatment programs. They've got a federal grant that tells them they have to do this. Wouldn't you think they would probably pay attention to it? You would, but they didn't. So pay attention. So let me get to I'm getting this wind-up thing, which means you just have to read through this stuff yourself. Basically, it says the best thing you should do is pick the strongest intervention you can do well. And when you see the slides, you'll see why. It talks about why. But pick the one that the program can do the best. Okay? This is the last point I'm going to make. Right? I've got many, many more. this is a guide developed by Drug Strategies. This is the one around juvenile justice. I think the one around treatment is even better. It's called Treating Teens. If you go to Drug Strategies, if you do nothing and get nothing else out of this presentation, I really want you to take this. Go to drugstrategies.com. You will find this. You'll also find something called Treating Teens. I think that one's better, even though this is related to criminal juvenile justice. That guide there, and you'll have to pay a terrible amount of $17.95 plus shipping and handling, but I get none of that, so this is not a commercial. I was on the panel that helped develop this, and that was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They ran out very quickly of all the free ones they could give away, so they're producing them at cost. It was developed for parents, but judges can use it, probation can use it, anybody in the juvenile justice system can use it, anybody who's interested in treatment can use it. I can't tell you how many parents have called me up and said, how do I find a good program for my kid? So that's what we try to do here. It gives you questions to ask your treatment program about assessment, about gender responsivity, about cultural competence, about what they do about continuing care, about all the things we would care about in treatment. Not even getting at, do you use an evidence-based practice, but what do you do about these things? And not only does it give you the questions, it gives you the answers you should hear and the answers you should not hear. So if you get this, there's no excuse for you not to go out to your treatment programs and find out and question them and see what in the heck they're actually doing that relates to effective adolescent treatment around substance use, mental health, and other issues that are identified in the process. So we're past time. I'll stick around if you want to ask any questions. We'll leave it at that. Thanks.